I wanted to talk about Zoroastrianism before the end of Epiphany, since this is the 8 weeks where we kind of celebrate, we're talking about stars, we're talking about our star words. This is the season after when the Magi came to bring the gifts to the Christ child. And the Magi were Zoroastrian.
You know that, how do we know that?
That's a good question. I know it, but I don't know that off the top of my head right now. It is one of the oldest religions. It was based in Persia, India. And so when they said they came from the east and they were following a star, and I don't know what other biblical scholars have figured out, but it's generally assumed that they were Zoroastrian. And the fascinating thing about that is Zoroastrianism still continues today. It is this ancient, the first monotheistic religion, and it still has followers today. And we actually have a member in our congregation whose father wrote a textbook. He grew up Zoroastrianism. I'm gonna keep going isms. He grew up Zoroastrian, and his father wrote what is kind of considered the basic textbook of the religion. I don't think there's a lot of texts out there that explain what it's all about. There's a couple of copies of this floating around the church. I'll pass this around. I did not read it. It's very thick, as you can see. But Xerxes Boat is a really fascinating guy, and he is a member of our church. And he referred me to a current congregation and someone I thought would be our speaker. But I talked to that gentleman, and he's older and weak and frail, and this is too early for him to be here in person or by Zoom. So he said he would love to answer any questions we have. He said Zoroastrianism is a lot like Christianity, except we believe that we don't believe in a Messiah that's going to save us. We believe it's up to us. And I thought that makes sense. It's not that like a choice. Yeah. And all of this is I really wanted to open that. I have a neighborhood that is Zoroastrian.
Should I share the screen?
Almost. All of this
No
is
rush.
based from Jeffrey Phillips. Xerxes then sent me a sermon from Reverend Phillips, the Epiphany sermon from the year 2024, I think, or 2023. Anyways, a very recent sermon where he was talking about world religions and Zoroastrianism. And he said, this just proves that we're all so much more connected than we ever were, and we all need to consider that. And I know that's what undergirds what WCC sees as their calling to be kind of a spiritual hub and engage all religions here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about spirituality. In that aim, I found two videos, and I thought they're both like 20 minutes, but we could watch a video and we could discuss, we could watch a video. The first one is a young, it's following a guy who's kind of like a guide. It's like he's doing an HD TV show or something, saying, "Oh, look at what I found. This is so interesting." But the cool part about it is it's following people who are actively doing the rituals now. The second video is kind of an old, insight, more information about the religion from some narrator talking about it, but not like an active follower, just kind of describing it. So it's a little bit drier. So we're gonna do that one second. We're gonna do the fun one first. Try to ignore the guy who kind of makes it all about himself. There is a lot that you learn about it in the process. So, okay.
Off to YouTube.
Will you be with me in spirit of prayer? God, we know that there are insights that flow to us in all different ways. We ask that you be with us now and help what we are about to watch. Give us a little bit of an insight for our day going forward, our week, and our year as we follow the stars that you've sent us.
Amen.
What do you think?
It kind of reminds me of Hare Krishna.
Yeah.
I've been to the upright service before, and they follow a similar pattern. They pray, they offer things at the end of this, and very similar.
Yeah.
So I guess, and even when it comes to Catholicism, is kind of similar too. At the end of the sermon, we present offering. So very similar.
That was one that I didn't think of. I had a whole list that I was making of all the similarities I found, but I'm curious to see what else you might have seen.
Sure. Looking at religious differences, I saw none. I saw cultural differences only. Because The fire is their symbol of purity. I'm thinking in Iran, a much more fertile land than the deserts of the three Abrahamic religions, where water was the only way to purify oneself. And water wasn't really something you were desperate for in between the Tigris and Euphrates, basically. A lot of similarities. Fire is purification. And then thinking about their version of what Christians would call for a budding, young person confirmation, or a Jewish bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah.
Yep.
They use purity, not so much a maturity, but what does an 11-year-old Zoroastrian have to be purified from? I was curious just to learn more about that. I guess as a youth, you're just confused, you don't understand much, but then you become a pure Zoroastrian. When you're old enough.
Catholics make their first confirmation when they're 7 years old.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
Seven up,
Mhm.
right? That's
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think of the purity is them bringing the purity to it, not become pure.
The children bringing the purity.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then in Christianity says you are born sinner.
Yeah.
So you coming into it and accepting it is when you are.
So that would be an opposite, right? The idea of original sin
Uh-huh.
being completely
The difference.
opposite of this.
Mhm.
Other than, when we were confirmed, we had before that, an examination by the entire congregation. And we were sitting up in the choir loft, and this was the week before confirmation. And we were examined, we had to profess knowledge from questions. Needless to say, we were pretty nervous.
Yeah.
Then when we had our first communion, which was involved in the same week, the communion, we received a verse from the scripture. And mine was, remember now thy creator in the days of thy youth.
Huh.
And that was, as it were, words to live by. So that was a gift from the congregation to us. So there was quite a bit going on, and we were between ages of 7 to 8 grade is the age that we were.
Thank you, Lucy. Nancy, you had your hand up.
I saw two things. I forget his name, Pierre
Teilhard.
Teilhard. I think he's equating wisdom with energy. And I think that Zora's story is wonderful. It has this energy that everyone has. It's this unity church.
Mm-hmm.
Man, I could be one, and in a second. And I also thought that this purity idea is energy, and that you don't just get it. You work it. You work it all your life, and from 11 years old, when you're a little boy or girl, you will receive what do you call this, when you, a sift, when you pour stuff in and then only the good stuff comes out. It's a,
Filter.
filter,
Mm-hmm.
thank you. And so at 11 years old, they give you a filter to be aware of all the time, and then all these reminders, oh, you have to do all this stuff. It's all the same. And I just love the idea that you have to keep at it all your life, every day.
Mm-hmm.
And it's universal. If everybody could, do that, have that, what a different world.
Right. It's really interesting that the putting on this garment, this white garment, which represents purity,
Yes,
on our torso and wearing that every day.
yes.
What kind of a message is that to every single day?
And to cover your face.
Yeah.
Remember, well, at least the people in charge of the service, you had to cover your face, they said, because your saliva might infect something or something, just to keep the human away from the spiritual, perhaps.
Yeah, but to be hugged by something around your torso all the time. I agree with you, Carol, that it would be Cause that strap, right, the strap has gotta be tied somewhat
It's
tightly.
binding.
Yeah.
Mormons also have the garment that they wear underneath clothes.
That's what I was,
Garment.
that's what I was gonna bring up, the Mormons have
And I'm thinking,
underclothes.
is that polyester?
Well, what's a hair shirt? Isn't that-
Well, that was for
No,
Catholic monks to punish themselves somehow, wearing a hair shirt for 30 days or something.
See it, they only wore it for 30 days.
It was some sort of going through some ritual of
Yeah.
hardship. Yeah, because it really itched.
That's not for one thing, and everybody just,
Can you hold that thought for a second? And I just want to follow up, Lois, you brought up the Mormons, and so I wanted to get the official word.
Should
There
look
is
it
a
up.
word called, they wear something called the temple garment, which is
yes.
underclothes, that you're supposed to wear under their clothes at all times unless bathing. And I only know about that because I heard a Moth Radio Hour tell a whole story about it, and I was
Oh.
like, oh, what? But you're very astute, Lois, you know that. Okay.
Now back to Nancy, and then as soon as you're done, I want to remind folks at home, please unmute yourselves. Nancy and JS and Nancy, or if you'd rather chat, we're hearing and seeing you. Go ahead, Nancy.
I just asked the question, is there a difference when you worry only about getting to heaven versus what we're seeing today?
Good question.
Think about sort of being good all day long, every day.
Depending on
Good
the.
thoughts, good.
Spend more of our time, maybe perfecting this life rather than worrying about only the
Yes,
later.
exactly.
We can get stuck that way.
When you look at the
There's something real false about it.
One person at a time, there's Andrea and there's Andy.
And please,
when you look at the religion, there seem to be a lot of similarities. Because the undergarment that they wear, if you go into Judaism, they also wear that, they wear the thing on their head. When you go to a Catholic church, they do similar things, and even the individual churches, they also have things that they do that you have to, in order to come for congregation service or something, you have to change into something. So it's
That's symbolic, isn't it?
yes. So it's like everybody's following a pattern, but based on how you understand it, you interpret it. It's what you're doing.
I saw similarities with all three Abrahamic religions. Andrea, what
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, this appeals to me and such, but the idea of heaven for a lot of people, I think is because their life here on earth isn't so hot, it's not so good. And that's probably all of our faults that other people's lives are so bad. But if you don't really have anything or hope or anything in this life, and your only hope really is for an afterlife. I personally don't believe in an afterlife, but my life feels pretty good, so maybe I would if I didn't have a good life.
Makes you have an afterlife in a way that you remember.
Well,
They become like you, because I think of my mother very often.
I know,
I figured,
I think that that way is difficult. I don't believe in like a technical heaven or hell.
but you know, in our mannerisms and our thoughts.
Yeah.
Are always.
I had a question. I sort of didn't understand that the little tiny pocket, what was that represent?
Your good deeds.
keep your good deeds there symbolically.
Oh, you put your good deeds, you hold your good deeds in there.
Yeah.
What gives me pause though is that the two Zoroastrians I do know, like Joseph Bog and my former neighbor, are very financially well off. And there's only like 150,000 left in the world. And I'm just wondering, is it just people who have, good means or, are well off financially that are able to maintain this religion? I was very surprised how they didn't show any other family, just those in country club and nice houses.
Yeah.
So,
The country club could just be a venue, I mean, there's a lot of places, they don't have a
they didn't look
church.
for it. That's the deal.
No,
I think about our host, kind of playing the, uneducated American doofus. Wow, an ancient religion at a country club. How modern is that? I mean, sorry, there's ancient religions all over the place.
well, some of the other
But-
things.
And I'm sorry, Betty?
This is off the subject a little bit, I guess. I couldn't help but think through the whole thing. That's a real area of unrest right now. And I'm wondering how they are adjusting to things.
The rights of Zoroastrians in modern day Iran? Who
So that-
knows?
That's what I found mostly when I looked up on YouTube, most of the talks I found were so embedded in conversation about Iran that I was like, this is over my head, I think it's gonna be over our head, so I went with the doofus. This is
My neighbors were Indian
yeah, I mean, I think they're spread worldwide, but they originally.
and extremely proud of being Zoroastrian, so they had a picture of Zoroastrian.
I thought there were some other interesting connections, like the bowing that they were doing before the fires. That's similar to the bowing that's done in Muslim prayer. If you watch people do the praying 5 times a day.
Mhm.
When they put the dot of ash on your forehead, did anybody have a
Yes.
flag?
Ash Wednesday, hello?
Except they were this, I think it represented different, like for us, we're remembering that we are ash. For them, they were remembering, it was having God within, was that what it was?
Mhm.
Something in the sacred fire, it's almost like a baptism or like an anointing with the ash.
Sacrament.
I felt like we should be anointing people in ash, you know, it's a little bit more, it's nicer.
Yeah.
And where the Hare Krishna, thank you, the good deeds, of course, are very similar. The one thing I wanted to say, how do you think it, as a pastor, I was really struck by the fact that that their priests are children.
Mm.
Or, you know, that they're empowered to marry and do all the rituals. I was just like, because I know sometimes children rise to the occasion of the responsibility you give them. Can you imagine what it would mean to Christianity? Like, if we're doing it right, confirmation should feel like for Lois Eve, it should be a strong thing. It should feel like you had to prep for it. You really, and you should get something that like a Bible verse that sticks with you for the rest of your life. And it helps have the gravitas that it should have to help you understand that you're entering into.
Really early.
Yeah, you're doing a commitment. But I was like, what more gravitas would you have if you were being empowered to actually, be the carrier on of the religion in that space? That is what I'm really, my brain
Well,
is
think
resting.
about the Dalai Lama.
I don't know anything about that Dalai Lama.
He's about to publish a new book. He said this is gonna be his last book.
The baby,
He's identified as an
they slept him as a baby.
and
Wow.
then brought up.
But that's like one leader for the whole religion. These are like all the priests, right? So all of the young people in your tradition are all just taking it so much more seriously because they are empowered with the ability to carry out the ritual. I just think there's some.
If you're going to
Learn
develop
that.
a religion, though, you really need to induct. You basically, in some ways, it's an indoctrination.
It both indoctrinates and it inspires.
It's inspired very, very early on, so that becomes a part of that person's life, right?
I mean, that's what the
day
Catholic.
by day training also,
Right.
it becomes a habit. And if it's enough of a habit, you feel lonely without it.
That's a beautiful thing to
So
say.
it had a community aspect because they would identify with somebody else who goes through the same thing as them. And then our isolation is the kind of communities these days. I think that's a very important part.
Right.
Yeah.
That's important. Yeah.
And I've always admired that the reason Catholics have such a strong religion is because they do so much with young people at a young age.
Mhm.
And Lutherans also seem to brand their young, people as they come up through the ranks. So I thought it was the moment for learning.
And Nancy, again, I'm sorry.
A wonderful memory, one of my sons, he traveled a lot in Tibet and when the Dalai Lama came to Chicago, Ricky was down there and when the Dalai Lama passed by where Ricky did something that's Tibetan, I don't know what he did, but something. And the Dalai Lama saw him and he went, oh, and he went right back to him.
Oh, wonderful.
And Ricky just adored the feeling. And it was like this energy that we feel. And so it illustrates that.
I was at the Parliament of World Religions, a number of us were. The district went down and met Henry now and heard him speak that whole wonderful week. And then I had forgotten my pass to get close in Grant Park when the Dalai Lama was there and spoke. But there was a big fence all the way around, and I got as close to the fence as I could and found out I was in the bunch of all the young Tibetan kids.
Oh, wow.
So I was part of this, about 30 of them. here living in Chicago.
Yeah.
And so I was part of the Tibetan party, listening to the Dalai Lama, which is probably just as good as
Wow.
having been close.
They all came out of Evanston and they,
Wonderful evening.
they all came out of Evanston and they pumped gas at Costco.
Oh, well, then.
Then they go to school in Sullivan High in Chicago, there's a lot of help too.
So if you have any burning questions about Zoroastrianism, like I said, I did have a conversation with Kersey, who is associate of Xerxes. And he would love to talk with us, but he would prefer to do like, if we have questions and record the interview kind of thing. So, I mean, that's still an opportunity. I can take some notes now, or if you want to email me any questions you have, I could talk with him and we could, bring it back, or I could send you the link so you could watch it at home. That's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say is we have another video, but I'm happy to let the conversation go and just send you the link for the video and you can watch that at your leisure.
You said it was dry, right?
Well, it's one guy talking, but there's maps and he talks, it's like the background. It's like probably like what you get from reading a Britannica as opposed to.
So more of a lecture than this cultural interchange.
As far as I'm concerned, I found this very interesting and informative, but I think this is about all I believe in living the here and now and being useful and moving forward as much as we can now. And I
We
just
have
feel this is
15
peace now.
What?
Would that be, we have 15 more minutes before we bring up. Will that be time for what? we
It's a
have?
17-minute video, so it'll be almost enough time.
We watch it now and then,
Let's do it.
Judy, you didn't say anything. Do you know any Zoroastrians in the Interfaith Alliance?
They have come to us.
oh, good.
On occasion, but not very often, as you said, and they're way out in the western suburbs.
Yeah.
So it's
Mhm.
very difficult.
Person lives in Orland Park.
Yeah.
Like, there's no way I could get there. It's like,
To this area.
Especially so early in the morning.
It was supposed to be the new Trier multi-family, so it's a bit of a stretch.
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to add to what Eleanor said about it. I think if you go deeply, you will find out that wealth is part of their criteria. Because it could be part of their criteria for being that, because
Mhm.
being wealthy. Because there are certain kind of religion when the way they recruit, they find something with you before. And it becomes like sort of intervening to find or helping you develop your worth, and it becomes part of the religion. There are certain religions like that. So, and then because everything that they do seem like kind of expensive, so I cannot afford to be, so they probably won't even entertain my or encourage.
Yeah, well, they might, I mean, the other thing is, are they taking Christianity, where, everyone's welcome. Islam, I believe everyone's welcome. Judaism's not so much come and convert. I think there's an old myth about you have to ask 3 times. Is Zoroastrianism somebody who's looking, or is it just people who have already grown up that way, right? You have to get there by the age of 7.
But initially started out that this was the dominant religion for 3,500 between, was it 500 BC and
500, 600 years before Christ and 600 years after Christ, it was the strongest
so it's
religion.
historical.
A lot to learn. Yes, from okay.
If we
That's
keep talking,
true about-
we're not going to see this film.
Right,
He's
exactly.
starting.
So this,
If you're, at the age of
Moving it.
11, you become a part of this idea. And so if I wanted to join at the age of 85, they would say, you have no chance, this starts when you're 11. Does that and so I noticed that everybody has the same gene pool. I mean, this is a very
Amen.
tight group.
okay, ready? Is the
Zoroastrianism is a religion that not many people know too much about or have indeed ever heard of. To some, the extent of that knowledge is that it's the religion that Freddie Mercury belonged to.
from
But the
Queen.
fact is, Zoroastrianism, historically speaking, is one of the most important religions to have ever existed. The religion of Zoroastrianism is old, it's very old. It originates in what is today Iran in the region known as Persia, with the appearance of the prophet and quote-unquote founder Zarathustra, also known as Zoroaster in Greek. Now, as with similar ancient figures like him, it's very, very hard, basically impossible, to pin down an exact date for when he lived. But scholars suggest that he might have lived around, well, between 1400 to 1200 BCE, while others also say that he may have lived around 800 BCE. So there isn't consensus about this. The religion practiced in Persia prior to Zarathustra's mission was a kind of polytheism or paganism, very closely connected to the Vedic tradition in India, from which other religions like Hinduism and Jainism and Buddhism also later developed. This can be seen by the fact that many of the gods cross over between the two traditions, but have slightly different names based on the language. This includes gods like Saraswati and Indra and many others. The deities worshipped by the Persians were associated with things like water and fire, as well as natural phenomena or abstract concepts like love and wisdom. The cult and worship surrounding these deities included things like offerings and animal sacrifice, all performed by a class of priests, very similar to the Brahmins of the Indian context. The prophet and founder Zarathustra most likely belonged to this class of priests. It is said that he would wander around Persia looking for wisdom and truth. And during these travels, he would see a lot of injustice, a lot of violence, and just a lot of nasty stuff in general, which would, of course, influence the very ethically based message that he would later convey. And his life, according to tradition, is said to have changed dramatically one day when he was celebrating a spring festival. And during this festival, he went down to the water to fetch some water for the festival. And after he had been standing in waist-high water and returned to shore, being thus ritually purified, he then suddenly had an intense vision of light. And in this light, he experienced the presence of the god Ahura Mazda and 6 other radiant beings, from which he then received his first revelation. The god Ahura Mazda was nothing new to Zarathustra or the Persians. He was a god who had been worshipped prior to this, and whose name literally means Lord of Wisdom. He was one of the more exalted gods in the pantheon, belonging to a group of gods called the Ahuras, the Indian equivalent of which is Ashura. What was so unique about the revelation that Zarathustra received and that he would convey was that Ahura Mazda was no longer just some god. He was now the one uncreated eternal god who was the creator of the world and of everything good. Ahura Mazda was the guardian and embodiment of a concept called Asha, meaning the order of the universe, and in a moral sense also represented things like righteousness and justice. The opposite of this is a term called drudge, synonymous with things like evil, falsehood, and violence. These forces were not the creation of Ahura Mazda, but by another immortal being called Angramenyu, or the hostile spirit. In the teachings of Zarathustra, the world of creation is a constant battlefield between the forces of Asha and drudge, between good and evil, light and darkness. Zarathustra himself left behind a collection of hymns known as the Gathas, which was first orally transmitted and then written down under the Sasanian Empire. The Gathas can be considered the sort of most sacred scriptures to the Zoroastrians and are part of a larger collection of sacred texts called the Avesta, the rest of which was written after Zoroaster or Zarathustra by priests. A question that quickly arises with this very strongly dualistic outlook is the very nature of Zoroastrianism's theology. Some claim that Zoroastrianism is a monotheistic religion, while others say that it is a dualistic faith or dualistic theology. Scholars and Zoroastrians alike have never really been able to agree on whether or not Zoroastrianism is a monotheistic religion or not. But if it is, that would be pretty significant, because then it would be most likely the oldest monotheistic religion in the world that we know of. Scholars like Mary Boyce argues for the dualistic alternative, describing Ahura Mazda and Angramenyu as equally uncreated opposing forces, while others like Farhan Mer proposes a view where Zarathustra's original message was that there was but one God, and dualistic forces were part of his creation, thus below him. But perhaps it's wiser to look at this from a more nuanced perspective and not try to define Zoroastrianism with such arbitrary and anachronistic, really, terms like monotheism or polytheism. There have been other arguments, like that of James Boyd and Donald Crosby, who suggest that none of the above explanations are good enough. Instead, they propose that, quote, in brief, the interpretation we favor is that Zoroastrianism combines cosmogonic dualism and eschatological monotheism in a manner unique to itself among the major religions in the world. This combination results in a religious outlook which cannot be categorized as either straightforward dualism or straightforward monotheism. The fact is that the old Iranian or Persian pantheon of gods remain in the Zoroastrian system, at least according to later interpretations of its theological ideas. When the prophet had his first vision at the river, it is said that he saw, along with Ahura Mazda himself, a group of 6 lesser beings. These are known as the Spentamenu, or 6 lesser divinities, all representing different attributes of the high god, like righteousness, devotion, and health, while remaining hierarchically beneath him and sort of part of his creation. They are sometimes considered emanations of Ahura Mazda, with the symbolism of a torch lighting other torches used to describe this process of emanation. Another term used to describe these lesser divinities is Amesha Spentas, or holy immortals. But this term is also used to refer to any lesser deity who emanates from Ahura Mazda and includes most of the old gods of the pantheon. Thus, worship and veneration of the old gods continued under Zoroastrianism, and especially of the highest 6 divinities, because these represented attributes of the high god Ahura Mazda and were thus worshipped separately. The exception to this is another group of deities known as the Devas, which also has an Indian equivalent of the same name. These gods represent things like violence and war, and thus they serve the hostile spirit Angrameni rather than Ahura Mazda. And Zarathustra very strongly rejected any worship of these devas, these deities. In Zoroastrian cosmology, creation is seen as cyclical and often divided into 3 phases. The first of which is called simply creation. It's the first phase when Ahura Mazda, God, creates the world in a perfect state, free from all evil and all darkness. But as soon as this creation comes about, the evil spirit Angramenu attacks it and infiltrates it with darkness and evilness. And this starts the second phase, known as mixture, when both good and evil, light and darkness, exist alongside each other in the world and are battling. This is the time we live in now. So obviously, giant pandas are the creation of Ahura Mazda, while stepping in water with your socks on is clearly the creation of Angrameni. Human beings are also important players in this cosmic battle. And much like the good deities have a responsibility to promote righteousness and goodness and expel evil and darkness from the world. This is done in a number of ways, but primarily through the basic moral principle that was laid down by Zarathustra, which is good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Thus, humans and creation have a clear purpose in Zoroastrianism, that is to gradually expel the forces of Angramenu, of evil, until the third and final phase is reached. It's called separation, where creation is once again in a perfect paradisial state. Given the fact that Zarathustra's message was so ethically based, he introduced certain ideas that were revolutionary for his time. For example, in his thought, people would be judged after death, and this judgment would lead either to reward or punishment. And most importantly, departed souls were judged based on their actions in this life, and not on things like riches or status, which was the case in the earlier pagan religion. Thus, reward was open to anyone. And so was punishment. So it didn't matter if you were rich or what status you had. If you'd been a bad person, you would end up being punished after death. If you had been deemed good, then you'd be able to cross a bridge into a paradise of delights. But if you had been bad, then that bridge would contract to the size of a blade's edge, and you would most likely fall down into hell, a place of great torment and torture. Furthermore, at the end of time, when the battle of good and evil is over, all the bodies of the dead will be resurrected and subjected to a last judgment, Ahura Mazda, after which you will either live in hell or remain in the paradise-like land of a perfected creation, which is now free from all evil and darkness. In terms of practice, Zoroastrianism has gone through a number of developments throughout history. Zoroastrians have often been rather negatively referred to as fire worshippers by the Muslim conquerors, for example. But this is a rather misleading term. It is true that fire plays an important role in the practice and symbolism of the faith, serving as the symbol for purity and God's wisdom and light. Fire, as well as water, appear to have been an important part of ritual for Zoroastrians since the very inception. But the appearance of things like fire temples or heightened platforms with fire altars appear to have been a much later development, probably sometime during the Achaemenid Empire. But nonetheless, fires and temples did become and still remain very important aspects of the faith and their practice. Connected to this, fire and its representation of purity is the idea of ritual purity, which is one of the most important aspects of this faith. It is the duty of every person to keep clean because dirtiness or uncleanliness is an aspect or manifestation of evil and darkness. This led to certain laws regarding ritual purity, which unfortunately, for example, limited women in their movements during their menstrual periods, for example, because they were seen as unclean for its duration. One can also see similar ideas expressed in the rather famous funerary rites of the Zoroastrians. As the body was considered unclean, once the soul had departed from it, the body was taken out to an open space where it would be eaten by animals, and then the bones would later be collected to await the day of resurrection. One should keep in mind that this is all connected to the cosmic battle between Ashta and Drudge, and thus seen as a necessary and logical measure to fulfill our purpose in creation. Moreover, another important ritual practice of Zoroastrianism is the celebration of 7 yearly festivals, all connected to the 6 Spentas, the higher divinities, and one also connected to fire, which could be seen as the sort of lifeblood of all of them. And the festival of fire is known as Nowruz, or also known today as Persian New Year, on the day of the spring equinox. And this was meant originally to signify, because the summer is coming, to signify the partial and temporary victory of light over darkness. The priest of Zoroastrianism is called Magi, a term that was used by the Greeks to refer to the entire religion as well. A fun fact is that according to the New Testament, there was 3 Magi that visited Jesus in Bethlehem carrying gifts, also known as sometimes as the 3 wise men. In fact, this connection to other religions is partly what makes Zoroastrianism so special. If you remember what I said in the beginning, Zoroastrianism is arguably one of the most important religions in history, and this is partly due to how much it has affected the religions of the world. Concepts introduced by the Zoroastrians like heaven and hell, the day of resurrection and the last judgment, as well as the dualistic cosmology with an evil adversary to God and his servants, the Devas, and even the idea of a coming savior, or in Abrahamic terms, Messiah. It is highly probable that these ideas made it into Judaism in the post-exile period, and thus very much influenced its development going forward. These ideas were then later picked up by both Christianity and Islam, and serves as some of the most fundamental aspects of these religions. So it isn't entirely wrong to say that many of the fundamental principles of the 3 Abrahamic world religions, as well as the Baha'i faith, have their direct origins in Zoroastrianism and the teachings of Zarathustra. After its initial spread, Zoroastrianism really only became a significant force on the world scene with the appearance of the Achaemenid Empire, also known as the Persian Empire, which adopted Zoroastrianism as a kind of state religion. And this is the empire, of course, with Cyrus the Great and Darius and Xerxes and all these people. Its doctrines further developed over time, and as it continued to serve as the state religion for the other empires, the Seleucids and the Sasanians, it sort of remained strong right up until the time of the Arab invasion at the advent of Islam, after which it kind of started to decline. It is true that the conquering Muslims often gave the Zoroastrians a hard time, that for much of history since then, they have been an oppressed minority. But one should also remember that in many periods and by many people, the Zoroastrians were also considered among the Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book, and thus they were considered protected people by the Muslims. But this doesn't change the fact that oppression still happened, of course. Temples were destroyed and so on. But one should be careful not to use a reading of history that is too black or white in any of the 2 extreme directions. As a result of these historical circumstances, many of the Zoroastrians moved to India, and over time there developed two rather distinct groups, often referred to as, on the one hand, the Iranian Zoroastrians, and on the other, the Indian Parsis, the later of which Freddie Mercury belonged to. A discussion on the history and distinction of these two groups will have to be saved for another time, but this grouping still remains today. But nonetheless, the persecution and oppression that the Zoroastrians have faced, especially in Iran, cannot be ignored in a video like this. It still continues to this day under the current Iranian leadership, and this unfortunate history has been a contributing factor to the religion's decline in numbers. The actual number of Zoroastrians in the world today is difficult to know for sure, partly due to the state of affairs in Iran. But a study conducted in 2012 by the Federation of Zoroastrian Associations of North America shows that the numbers might be slightly above 100,000 people, which of course isn't a lot. And most of these live in India or central Iran, with also diaspora communities in places like North America and Great Britain. Indeed, Zoroastrianism is sometimes called a dying religion due to its decreasing numbers and partly due to its reluctance to accept any converts. The reality might be such that in the near future there won't be any Zoroastrians left. And this would be a shame because it's a fascinating and rich tradition and one that is incredibly significant for our world heritage and the development of the so-called world religions. We probably wouldn't be where we are without Zoroastrianism and Zarathustra. But let's continue this discussion in the comments. For example, do you think that Zoroastrianism is a monotheistic or a dualistic faith? And do you think there's any chance of it surviving into the future? To any Zoroastrians out there, I hope I have represented your faith in a fair and acceptable manner, and I'll see you next time.
So I'm
On what? Or tell us what you're clear on. I mean, this is a lot of, I'm not clear on anything.
Are women allowed to be in leadership positions? I didn't see any pictures that
Didn't really cover that. He didn't mention that, just for
boys.
young children. Yeah, did he? The first thing mentioned just young boys were, but there were girls. I
And
don't
also
know.
at the end, they said they don't accept converts, so that answered that.
Okay, no.
That's it, not accepting converts. You're either born in the religion or you just can't be.
Yeah.
That's a picture of that.
Or you have to do
That's a
it
dying
when you're
religion.
7 years old.
It's too confining anyway.
That makes it hard.
Very, very close to Mr.
Thanks for coming, everybody. I'll see you next week.
It's very close to Freemasonry as well.
You think so? That's something I don't know enough about either.
Yes, it's but Freemasonry is
Just a
it's
second.
not not
Oh,
a religion.
Christianity.
Yeah, no, they collect everybody, they accept everybody. See, like, when
Yeah.
you go to churches, they fire that they do, we burn candles,
Yeah, yeah.
everything is.
Of course.